G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Footsteps of the Messiah. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into session 25. We're looking at the prophetically what happens to the Arab nations. We looked at Lebanon and southern Jordan last session. Lebanon and Jordan last session. In this session, we're going to just have a look at Egypt. It's the next one, and we're talking about how they relate to Israel, what's going to happen to them in these last days. Well, Egypt, peace will come between Israel and Egypt, but it comes initially by means of destruction, and later on it comes by means of conversion. They come to believe in Yeshua. So Egypt's future is given to us in Isaiah 19, verses 1 to 22. In verse 1 to 10, the prophet described the punishment of Egypt because of her sins. Egypt is going to be hit by civil war, desolation, and famine. In verses 11 to 15, Isaiah stated that the root cause of Egypt's devastation is her leaders who have led the nation astray. Now, under the dictatorship of presidents like Farouk and Nasser and Sadat, Egypt went to war against Israel on 4 occasions, and each occasion resulted in heavy losses for Egypt, and it ended up wrecking her economy. Now, out of all of this, there developed a fear in Egypt of Israel, as we see Isaiah saying in Isaiah 19, 16 to 17. In that day shall the Egyptians be like unto women, and they shall tremble and fear because of the shaking of the hand of Jehovah of hosts, which he shakes over them. The land of Judah shall become a terror unto Egypt. Everyone to whom mention is made thereof shall be afraid. Now, at no time in past ancient history has this ever been true. Egyptian forces used to pass through the land of Israel freely, even in the days of King Solomon. But only since 1948, and especially since the Six-Day War, have the Egyptian forces exhibited the fear portrayed in this passage. There has been a dread in Egypt of Israel ever since that time. After having lost 4 wars against Israel with heavy casualties, that fear is deeply rooted in Egypt. Prophetically, today is still the period of Isaiah 19, 16 to 17. Eventually, peace will come between Israel and Egypt, and initially, the peace is going to be a political one when the Hebrew language will be spoken in Egypt by 5 cities, according to Isaiah 19, verse 8. In that day, there shall be 5 cities in the land of Egypt that speak the language of Canaan and swear to Jehovah of hosts. Now, remember, in Isaiah's day, the language of Canaan was Hebrew. Now, we don't know how this prophecy will be fulfilled. What's going to happen, this will slowly give way to Egypt's conversion, described in verses 19 to 22 of Isaiah 19. We're going to see in 19 to 22, there's going to be 19 to 20, there's going to be an altar to Jehovah in the midst of the land. So this altar will be built. It shall be for a sign and for a witness unto Jehovah of hosts in the land of Egypt. So it's going to be a witness to the power of the God of Israel to save the land of Egypt. Now, this nation, Egypt, will be greatly oppressed by the forces of the Antichrist and his armies. We find that in Daniel 11, verses 42 to 43. Daniel 11, 42 to 43. But even though the Antichrist comes against them, but we see in verse 20, God will send them a savior and a defender, and he will deliver them. And he will deliver them from the domination of these oppressors. Now, the Egyptians are going to realize that Allah, the Muslim God, cannot save them, but only Jehovah, the God of Israel, can save them. And this will lead to a national conversion of Egypt. Jehovah shall be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians shall know Jehovah in that day. That's verse 21, Isaiah 19. And they're going to worship him with oblations, sacrifices, and vows. So the same God who brought about their destruction will also bring about their regeneration. It says in verse 22, he will be entreated of them and he will heal them. And that is when they turn to him in faith. So Egypt are going to turn to Jehovah God of Israel in faith in the future. Now, in conjunction with the latter days of the tribulation of the campaign of Armageddon, there will be the national conversion of Egypt. So the Egyptians are going to take, or the Egyptians will take their place in the ranks of the sheep Gentiles. Remember the sheep Gentiles? That's the sheep and goat Gentiles of Matthew 24. Sheep Gentiles are those who believe in Messiah, in the Messiahship of Jesus. They're the ones who come through the tribulation. They're the ones in the judgment at the end of the tribulation by Jesus. Now, according to Daniel 11, verse 40, Egypt will be one of the nations that is going to move against the Antichrist. But you know, because of her long-standing hatred of Israel, in the outworking of that, remember that cursing principle of the Abrahamic covenant, bless those who bless you, curse those who curse you, Egypt is going to suffer desolation like that of Edom. Now, this is according to Joel 3:19, where Joel prophesying about in the distant future, Egypt shall be a desolation and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness for the violence done to the children of Judah because they have shed innocent blood in their land. Now, so what we see here is that the sin of Egypt is the same as that of Edom, mistreatment of the Jews, and so punishment will come. With Edom, it's going to be total and permanent. It's going to be desolation and wilderness. But with Egypt, it will be total, yet it's going to be temporary. Desolation, but not a wilderness. In fact, the desolation of Egypt is to last only for the first 40 years of the millennium, as we see in Ezekiel 29, verses 1 to 16, sorry. Ezekiel 29, 1 to 16. Ezekiel was commanded to prophesy against Egypt in verses 1 and 2. Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Going on in verses 3 to 5, he was to predict the coming dispersion of the Egyptians from their land. I will put hooks in your jaws, and I'll cause the fish of your rivers to stick onto your scales. I'll bring you up out of the midst of your rivers with all the fish of your rivers which stick onto your scales. And I'll cast you forth into the wilderness, you and all the fish of your rivers. Now, this dispersion, because of their long history of mistreatment of Israel, in verses 6 to 7, they have been a staff, this is Egypt compared to Israel, they have been a staff of reed to the house of Israel. When they took hold of you by your hand, you did break and did rend all their shoulders. And when they leaned upon you, you broke and made all their loins to be at a stand. So this is their mistreatment of Israel, and this is the reason why they're going to have desolation for the first 40 years in the kingdom. Now, verses 8 to 10 tell us that the land of Egypt will suffer a period of total desolation. Now, verse 9, and the land of Egypt shall be a desolation and a waste, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. I will make the land of Egypt an utter waste and desolation. But then, going on in verses 11 to 12, it now tells us the duration. Her cities among the cities that are laid waste shall be a desolation 40 years. And so what we're going to see is that the Egyptians will be scattered all over the world like Israel was before her. But after the end of 40 years, the Egyptians will be regathered in verse 13, and they're going to be brought back into their land. Now, though Egypt will become a kingdom again, it will never be a powerful one, because verse 15 tells us, it shall be the basest of the kingdoms, neither shall it any more lift itself up above the nations, nor will Israel ever again be guilty of placing her confidence in Egypt. Now, rather, the Jewish people shall know that I am the Lord Jehovah and will trust in the Lord their God. So what we see regarding Egypt, in summary, peace will come between Israel and Egypt by means of conversion. Only when the Egyptians worship the same God as Israel through Jesus the Messiah will peace finally come. For the first 40 years of the millennium, the land of Egypt will be desolate and the Egyptians will be dispersed all over the world. But afterward, they'll be regathered, becoming a kingdom once again. Now, Assyria is northern Iraq. It's northern Iraq. This is another Arab enemy of modern day Israel. But peace will come between Israel and northern Iraq by means of conversion, according to Isaiah 19, 23 to 25. In that day there shall be a highway out of Egypt to Assyria, and the Assyrian shall come into Egypt, and the Egyptian into Assyria, and the Egyptians shall worship with the Assyrians. Now, verse 23, this is what we just read, describes an economic unit that will encompass Egypt, Israel, and Assyria. The famous highway of the ancient world, known as the Via Maris, has ceased to function ever since 1948, when Israel became a nation again. That year, Egypt and Syria closed their borders, marking the highway, or making the highway impassable. However, in the millennium, when peace will be restored, all borders will be open, and the highway, which is a symbol of economy, will be restored between these Middle Eastern states. Now, the means by which this will occur is verses 24 to 25. In that day shall Israel be the third with Egypt and with Assyria, a blessing in the midst of the earth, for that Jehovah of hosts has blessed them, all three. So not only will Egypt undergo a conversion experience, but so will the ancient area of Assyria. Assyria will become a blessing in the earth and will receive a blessing from God. So that's Egypt and Assyria. The three former enemies will now have spiritual, economic, and political unity. In the second part of verse 25, God says, "Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, my inheritance." So the spiritual unity that we see here will be the basis for the other unities, political, economic. So peace will come between Israel and Assyria, which is northern Iraq, by means of conversion. And when this happens, there will be economic, political, and religious unity, because they'll all worship the same God, Jehovah, the God of Israel. Now we have two nations called Kedar and Hazor. It's one nation, Kedar and Hazor, and this is Saudi Arabia. Peace will come between Israel and Saudi Arabia by means of destruction. And this we find in Jeremiah 49, verses 28 to 33. The passage here describes total devastation of Saudi Arabia by war until the inhabitants are scattered and dispersed all over the world. Now, as for the land itself, Jeremiah 49, verse 33 states, "And Hazor shall be a dwelling place of jackals, a desolation forever. No man shall dwell there, neither shall any son of man sojourn therein." So the land of Saudi Arabia will be a perpetual desolation throughout the millennium, and the residents will be dispersed everywhere. Now, while Egypt's desolation and dispersion will only last 40 years, for Saudi Arabia, it's going to last for all of the 1,000 years. So peace will come between Israel and Saudi Arabia via destruction. Now we have Elam. Remember these names, Elam and Kedar, and that they're the names we find in Genesis. Now, Elam, which is Persia or Iran. So ancient Elam covers Persia or modern day Iran. Now, Iran is not an Arab state. It's Persian. It's a Persian state. But its future, we're going to have to look at it because it shares the same religion with the Arabs, which is Islam. Peace will come between Israel and Iran by means of destruction, according to Jeremiah 49, 34 to 39. In verses 34 to 38, Jeremiah described the destruction of Elam, with the inhabitants being completely dispersed all over the world. Then verse 39 declares, "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring back the captivity of Elam," or Iran, says Jehovah. So 34 to 38 tells us destruction, inhabitants completely dispersed. But then 39 says Jehovah's going to bring him back into the land. So the destruction of Iran will be partial and the dispersion will be temporary. Eventually, the inhabitants will return and resettle Iran. The future of this nation is like that of Egypt. But the length of time the Iranian people will be in dispersion, we have no idea. It doesn't tell us. Scriptures don't tell us. So peace will come between Israel and Iran via, first of all, destruction, dispersion, and then a conversion and a return. There's going to be a saved nation of Elam or Persia or Iran in the millennium. Now, there's two desolate spots of the kingdom in the millennial kingdom or Messianic kingdom. During the Messianic kingdom, the entire world will be fruitful and very productive. We've seen that before in the previous studies. And the planet will be characterized by beauty. It's going to be a wonderful place. But there's going to be two desolate spots of burning pitch and brimstone throughout the period of the kingdom. And they are Babylon and Edom. Babylon is southern Iraq, the area of southern Iraq. So this spot here will be the former world capital of the Antichrist. That was his world capital, Babylon. Now, several passages make this point, one of which is Isaiah 13, verses 20 to 22. It shall never be inhabited, neither shall it be dwelt in from generation to generation. Neither shall the Arabian pitch tent there, neither shall shepherds make their flocks to lie down there. But wild beasts of the desert shall lie there, and their houses shall be full of doleful creatures, and ostriches shall dwell there, and wild goats shall dance there. And wolves shall cry in their castles, and jackals in the pleasant palaces. And her time is near to come, and her days shall not be prolonged. So we're talking here about about Babylon, southern Iraq. Now, Jeremiah 50, verse 39 to 40, he tells us some more. He says these uninhabitable ruins are comparable to Sodom and Gomorrah. Therefore, the wild beasts of the desert with the wolves shall dwell there, and the ostriches shall dwell therein. And then he goes on to say that as when God overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah and the neighbor cities thereof, says Jehovah, so shall no man dwell there, neither shall any son of man sojourn therein. So later on, from Jeremiah 50, Jeremiah emphasized the totality and completeness of Babylon's destruction. And Jeremiah writes this in Jeremiah 51, verses 41 to 43. How has Babylon become a desolation among the nations? Her cities are become a desolation, a dry land and a desert, a land wherein no man dwells, neither does any son of man pass thereby. So what Jeremiah has prophesied here is that throughout the kingdom period, no man will even so much as pass by the ruins of Babylon, something that is hardly true today. It never happened. So not only is Babylon to be a desolate waste throughout the millennium, it will also be a place of continual burning and smoke, according to Revelation 19, verse 3. And the second time they say, hallelujah, and her smoke goes up forever and ever. That was speaking about Babylon. Now, animals, as we know them, like they are today, your dogs and cats and all these things, cannot live in a place of continual burning pitch and brimstone. So that would mean that the beasts mentioned in Isaiah 13, 20 to 22, and Jeremiah 50, 39 to 40 cannot be literal animals. Now, Revelation 18, verses 1 to 2 explains what these animals are. And in these two verses, we have an angel coming down from heaven, and he cried with a mighty voice, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, and is become a habitation of demons, and the hold of every unclean spirit, and the hold of every unclean and hateful bird. So, according to this angel, Babylon is now the habitation of demons. This place of continual burning and smoke is going to be a place of confinement for many demons during the millennial period. That's 1,000 years. And it's clear from Revelation 9 and other passages that demons have animal-like features. And this is what the animals of Isaiah and Jeremiah passages represent. In fact, The Hebrew word translated as wild goats in Isaiah 13, verse 21, actually means demons in goat form. That's what it means. Now, the second desolate spot in the millennium will be Edom. Now, this is also pointed out by several of the prophets, such as Isaiah 34, 8 to 15. Edom is going to become a perpetual desolation because of her sins against Israel. Verse 8 to 9, Jehovah has a day of vengeance, a year of recompense for the cause of Zion. And the streams of Edom shall be turned into pitch, and the dust thereof into brimstone, and the land thereof shall become burning pitch. So, just like Babylon, the nation is to become a place of continual burning and smoke. And verse 10 says, it shall not be quenched night nor day. The smoke thereof shall go up forever. From generation to generation, it shall lie waste. None shall pass through it forever and ever. It's going to be inhabited by various birds and animals and characterized by confusion in verse 11. No human being will live in Edom. Only the animals mentioned before. Now, and it shall be, here it says here, it shall be a habitation of jackals, a court for ostriches, and the wild beasts of the desert shall meet with the wolves, and the wild goat shall cry to his fellow. Yes, the night monster shall settle there and shall find her a place to rest. Again, animals as we know them cannot live in a place of burning pitch and burning brimstone. So two clues in this text show that these are not literal birds and animals, as we just saw before from Isaiah. The Hebrew word translated as wild goats means demons in goat form. And the word translated as night monsters means night demons. So Babylon, like Edom, will also be an abode of demons. Now, another prophecy in Jeremiah 49, 17 to 18 tells us this. Edom shall become an astonishment. Everyone that passes by it shall be astonished and shall hiss at all the plagues thereof. As in the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah and the neighbor cities thereof, says Jehovah, no man shall dwell there, neither shall any son of man sojourn therein. So here we see that the emphasis is on the totality of destruction. No human will inhabit the land of Edom or even pass through it. Like Babylon, the desolation will be similar to that of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, the reason for such massive destruction in Edom is amplified by Ezekiel 35, 10 to 15. Verses 10 to 13, because of Edom's, she was very happy over the fall of Israel and Judah. She was gleefully happy over that. Ezekiel says, because you have said, these two nations and these two countries shall be mocked, and we will possess it, now punishment must come. Edom was saying that they were going to possess Judah and Israel. So while the whole earth is being beautified and rejoicing, Edom will be a desolation. Verse 14 says, thus says the Lord Jehovah, when the whole earth rejoices, I will make you desolate. So the calamities that fell on Israel and over which Edom rejoiced will now fall on Edom in a more severe way. Remember, I'll bless those who bless you, I'll curse those who curse you, like for like. Verse 15 says, as you did rejoice over the inheritance of the house of Israel because it was desolate, so will I do unto you. You shall be desolate, O Mount Seir, and all Edom, even all of it, and they shall know that I am Jehovah. Finally, Joel, one of the minor prophets, Joel 3:19 tells us, Egypt shall be a desolation, and Edom shall be a desolate wilderness, for the violence done to the children of Judah, because they have shed innocent blood in their land. So Egypt's desolation, we know, will be limited to 40 years. As for Edom, because of her unique violence against Israel, her desolation will be permanent and last for 1,000 years. Now, throughout the whole Messianic kingdom, while the earth is blossoming as the rose, Babylon and Edom will be places of continually burning pitch and burning brimstone. The smoke will rise and be visible for the entire 1,000 years. While Satan will be confined in the abyss, his demons will be confined in Babylon and Edom. These two places will be the abode of demons for the entire kingdom period. Now, this is just a summary of the Arab states and Iran. So we see Lebanon's going to be won over by occupation, Edom, southern Jordan, total destruction, Moab, central Jordan, partial destruction and conversion, Ammon, which is northern Jordan, partial destruction and conversion, Egypt, partial destruction, desolation, conversion, then they're back into the land. Assyria, northern Iraq, conversion, Saudi Arabia, total destruction, Persia, Iran, or Elam, partial destruction, dispersion, conversion, return back to the land. Southern Iraq, total destruction. Two desolate spots, Babylon and Edom. So that brings us now to the loosing of Satan and the final invasion of Israel. And this is what we call the aftermath. This is after all this has taken place. Now, during the time of the millennium, the most ideal conditions will be on the earth. In fact, it'll be the best time since Adam fell. But it will not be a perfect situation. Why? Because remember, sin and death, even though it's going to be reduced a lot, will not be eliminated. And a great number of unregenerate men will be alive at the time of the close of the Messianic kingdom. Now, these will be all born during the last century of the millennium. So it is after 1,000 years of ideal conditions and environment that the Messianic kingdom ends with one last test for man. This is just a pictorial view of where we have the aftermath. Aftermath is now after the Messianic kingdom, and it's before the eternal order. So here we're going to have the loosing of Satan, the final invasion, great white throne judgment, second resurrection, followed by the second death, the lake of fire. All right, the loosing of Satan and the final invasion of Israel. The millennium, the 1,000-year reign ends when Satan is released from his fifth abode. Remember, he was locked away in the abyss for that 1,000 years. Revelation 20, verses 7 to 10. When the 1,000 years are finished, Satan shall be loosed out of his prison and shall come forth to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together to the war, the number of whom is as the sand of the sea. And they went up over the breadth of the earth and encompassed the camp of the saints about and the beloved city. And the fire came down out of heaven and devoured them. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where are also the beast and the false prophet, and they shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. So once the full 1,000 years are completed, Satan will now be released out of his confinement in the abyss. And he's going to once again do the work of deception among the Gentile nations on the earth. Now, by this time, a great number of unbelievers will exist, all of whom will be under the 100-year age. And this was according to Isaiah 65. Now, the expression Gog and Magog, what this does is this simply points to the extent of the work of deception reaching the extremities of the earth, and hints at a similarity with the invasion described in Ezekiel 38, 1 to 39, 16, which will occur prior to the Great Tribulation. The similarity is that this too is going to be an invasion of Israel. The work of deception will be massive. It's going to be a worldwide revolt will begin to form, and eventually millennial Israel will be invaded, and Jerusalem will be surrounded by these deceived Gentile armies. But once these armies arrive at the mountain of Jehovah's house, they'll be quickly dispensed with by fire out of heaven, destroying them massively and suddenly. Now, at this point, the instigator of this revolt will be placed into his sixth and final abode, which is the lake of fire. Now, this is Satan being cast into the lake of fire. That was verse 10 of chapter 20 of Revelation. So this will be both his final and his eternal dwelling place. It's a place of torment for all eternity. He will now join the Antichrist and the false prophet, because they entered it at the start of the 1,000 year, after the tribulation period. They entered it. They were cast in there by Jesus at the start of the millennial kingdom. So now, career of Satan is now finally finished. Now, with this final revolt, the millennial kingdom will end, and there's going to be a transfer of authority, which we find Paul writing in 1 Corinthians 15, 24 to 28. Now, ultimately, the power and the authority of the kingdom must be turned over to God the Father. But this can only occur after every enemy of man is abolished, and there is no longer any challenge to God's rule, authority, and power. Verse 24 tells us this, 1 Corinthians 15. Then comes the end, when he shall deliver up the kingdom to God, even the Father, when he shall have abolished all rule and all authority and power. Now, Jesus is the one delivering up the kingdom. Now, for this very reason, Messiah must rule until every single enemy of man has been placed under subjection. Now, verse 25 says he must reign till he has put all his enemies under his feet. Now, the last enemy of man is not Satan. The last enemy of man is death itself. Verse 26 tells us this. The last enemy that shall be abolished is death. Now, remember, death still exists in the kingdom. Now, only after Satan's final revolt and his confinement in the lake of fire can death be abolished. Satan caused death for man by tempting the first parents. So it is only when he, the originator of death for man, is forever confined in this final abode that death can be abolished. And at this point, it will be. So with this, the millennial kingdom will come to an end. All things will now have been placed in total subjection to the Messiah, and that totality of subjection will now be subjugated to God the Father in order that God may be all in all. Verse 27 and 28 tells us it. For he put all things in subjection under his feet, but when he says all things are put on in subjection, it is evident that he is accepted who did subject all things unto him. And when all things have been subjected unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subjected to him that did subject all things unto him, that God may be all in all. There's a lot of subjecting there. What it is once everything is under the subjection of Jesus the Messiah, he now puts it under the subjection of God the Father. The great white throne judgment. We find this in Revelation 20, verses 11 to 12. This is going to come at the end of the millennium and in preparation for the establishment of the eternal order. Verse 11 of Revelation 20. And I saw a great white throne and him that sat upon it, from whose face the earth and the heaven fled away, and there was found no place for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were opened, and another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged out of the things which are written in the books according to their works. So this prophecy begins with a vision of one sitting on a great white throne. That is, it doesn't tell us his name, but that is Jesus the Messiah. Why? Because it is to him that all judgment has been given, according to John chapter 5, verse 22. A passing away of the old order will occur at the time of the judgment. The present heavens and earth in existence since Genesis 1 will be done away with. And that which was renovated for the millennium, but polluted all over again with man's last revolt, will now be removed forever. And I saw the dead, great and the small, standing before the throne. The books were open. Now, this is going to leave things ready for the judgment itself. The judgment will pertain to all unbelievers of all time. The purpose of this judgment is not to determine whether a person is saved, for that has already been settled forever one way or another at death. The purpose of this judgment will be to determine the degree of punishment. There is a principle in Scripture that does teach degrees of punishment based upon the degrees of sinfulness and upon greater or lesser light or knowledge and the response or lack of it to that light. In Matthew 11, 20 to 24, Jesus spoke of things being more tolerable for some than for others in the day of judgment. Remember, he says, "Woe unto you, Chorazin! Woe unto you, Bethsaida! For if the mighty works had been done in Tyre and Sidon, which were done in you, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I say to you, it shall be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon in the day of judgment than for you." In verse 23, "And you, Capernaum, shall you be exalted unto heaven? You shall go down unto Hades. For if the mighty works had been done in Sodom, which were done in you, it would have remained until this day. Verse 24, "But I say unto you that it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom in the day of judgment than for you." And in Luke 12, 47 to 48, Jesus speaks of a few stripes and many stripes. Verse 47, "And that servant who knew his Lord's will and made not ready, nor did according to his will, shall be beaten with many stripes. But he that knew not and did things worthy of stripes shall be beaten with few stripes. And to whomsoever much is given, of him shall be much required. To whom they commit much, of him they'll ask more." So in John 19, another passage here in John 19, verse 11, Jesus quantified sin, saying, "He that delivered me unto you has greater sin." So obviously there are then degrees of sin, degrees of punishment. One's appearance at the great white throne judgment will be a direct result of failing to believe on Jesus as the Messiah. But the degree of punishment will be based upon one's works. Now, in determining the degrees of punishment, Revelation 20, verse 12 mentions books in addition to the book of life. Now, a distinction needs to be made here between the book of life, the Lamb's book of life, and the other books mentioned in verse 12. According to Psalm 139, verse 16, the book of life contains the names of every person who was ever born. "Your eyes did see my unformed substance, and in your book they were all written, even the days that were ordained for me, when as yet there was none of them. Those who have their names, those who believe have their names retained in the book of life," according to Revelation 3, verse 5. "He that overcomes shall thus be arrayed in white garments, and I will in no wise blot his name out of the book of life. And I'll confess his name before my Father and before his angels." However, in Psalm 69, verse 28, the unsaved, that's the unbelievers, have their names blotted out of the book of life. Psalm 69, 28 says, "Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written with the righteous." So during the judgment at the great white throne, those whose names are not found in the book of life are the unsaved, the unbelievers. Therefore, they are worthy of partaking in this particular judgment. It is at this point the other books mentioned in verse 12 are used, and these other books contain accounts of one's deeds and responses. It is based on what is written in these books that the degrees of punishment will be determined. The third book mentioned in the scriptures is the Lamb's book of life. This book contains the names of every individual who is born again. According to Revelation 13, verse 8, their names were written in this book before the earth was even created. All that dwell on the earth shall worship him, everyone whose name has not been written from the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb that has been slain. This book is mentioned again in Revelation 17, verse 8. "And they that dwell on the earth shall wander, they whose name has not been written in the book of life from the foundation of the world, when they behold the beast how that he was and is not and shall come. In Psalm 69:28, the Lamb's book of life is known as the book of the righteous. Let them be blotted out of the book of life and not be written with the righteous. So it's the book of the righteous. Now, based on God's election and foreknowledge, this book contains the names of only those who are born again. And because salvation is eternally secure and sure, it is impossible to be blotted out of the Lamb's book of life. It is an impossibility. We come to the second resurrection. This is in the aftermath. Revelation 20, verse 13. And the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them, and they were judged every man according to their works. Now, following the description of the judgment, there is the account of the second resurrection. The first resurrection is composed of believers only. The second resurrection will be composed of unbelievers only. The two resurrections are going to be separated by a period of 1,000 years. And just as the first resurrection will come about in stages, remember, Jesus was the first fruits, then the church saints, the Old Testament saints, and then come the tribulation saints. That was the stages in which the resurrection took place. Second resurrection will also be in stages. First fruits of the second resurrection, remember, he was the Antichrist. He was raised from the dead. His death and resurrection we saw that earlier on in the piece. 1,000 years after the resurrection of the Antichrist, all the other unbelievers will now be resurrected. Their souls will be relinquished by hell. Hell will give up their souls, and they'll be reunited with their resurrected bodies. They'll then be judged at the great white throne based on their works. The second death, lake of fire, we find in Revelation 20, verses 14 to 15. After the sentence of the great white throne judgment comes the execution of it. Verse in Revelation 20, 14 to 15, it says, and death and Hades were cast into the lake of fire. This is the second death, even the lake of fire. And if any was not found written in the book of life, he was cast into the lake of fire. The second resurrection will soon give way to the second death in the lake of fire, which will be the eternal abode of the lost. Now, a lot of evangelistic preaching tends to focus on believing in order to avoid spending eternity in hell and in order to spend eternity in heaven. Well, the truth is, and neither of those are biblically correct. In the Hebrew scriptures, both the righteous and the unrighteous were said to go to a place called Sheol in Hebrew, Hades in Greek. Remember, or you might recall, the Old Testament sacrifices simply covered the sins of the Old Testament saints. It did not remove them. Hebrews 10:4 tells us that. Hebrews 10:4. Only the death of Messiah could remove those sins. So while the sacrificial system was sufficient to keep people from hell, it was not able to get them into heaven. All who died, both the righteous and the unrighteous, went to Sheol or Hades. According to Luke 16, it had two compartments. Luke 16, 19 to 31. We had an evil compartment, which we call hell, which again we'll see in Luke. And then we had a good compartment called Abraham's bosom or paradise. This schematic here gives us a bit of a go. Jesus told a story of a rich man and a beggar in Luke 16, 19 to 31. Both of them died. Beggar died and he was carried away by the angels into Abraham's bosom. Rich man also died and he was buried. And in Hades, he lifted up his eyes, being in torments, and sees Abraham afar off and Lazarus in his bosom. So they both died, both ended up in Hades, in Sheol, but one of them is in the unbelievers' side, in hell. The other one is in a place called Abraham's bosom. And the story Jesus tells a story, and that the guy in the unbelieving side, he was in torment. He asked Lazarus to dip his finger in some water and touch his tongue to relieve his torment. But Abraham, who was in the paradise side, the righteous side, he says, besides all this, between us and you, there is a great gulf fixed. That's that great gulf we see there in the middle, and that would pass from hence to you may not be able, and that none may cross over from thence to us. So according to this passage, Hades or Sheol, two compartments. One was for the righteous, one was for the unrighteous. Unrighteous would be called hell, in the way that we use the term hell today. Hell is a bad place today. It was a place of torment. He showed us that in verses 23, 25, and 28. The other compartment where the righteous went was known as Abraham's bosom. And it was a place of comfort, according to Luke 16:25. But it's not heaven. They were simply waiting there. The righteous portion of hell in another passage is called paradise in Luke 23:43. Remember the thief on the cross? He said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. He says, this day you'll be with me in paradise. While the people on the two sides could see each other and communicate with each other, they were separated by this gulf between the two of them. And that made it impossible for someone on one side to cross over to the other side. When an Old Testament saint died, his body was buried in the earth while his soul went to the righteous side, which was Abraham's bosom or paradise. Now, on the other side, when an Old Testament sinner died, his body was also placed in the ground, buried in the ground, but his soul went into hell. And then if you see from hell, he goes to the great white throne judgment. And the great white throne judgment, he's now going to be cast into the lake of fire for eternity. Whereas the believers will go from Abraham's bosom, from paradise, up into heaven. Now, when Jesus died, he not only paid the price of all future sins, but he paid the price of all previous sins. Romans 3:25, Hebrews 9:15 tells us this. Romans 3:25, Hebrews 9:15. So the sins of the Old Testament saints were now removed. What happened next, we find in Ephesians chapter 4, verses 8 to 10. Wherefore, he says, when he ascended on high, he led captivity captive and gave gifts unto men. Now, this he ascended, what is it but that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He that descended is the same also that ascended far above all the heavens, that he might fill all things. So, while Jesus was crucified, he died. While his body remained in the tomb, his soul went down into the paradise side of Sheol, announcing that the atonement had been made. And at the time of his ascension, all the souls of the Old Testament saints were now removed from Abraham's bosom and brought into heaven. That's where he led captivity captive. In this way, the righteous portion of Sheol was eliminated and is no longer in existence. Today, when an unbeliever dies, his body is still buried in the ground and his soul goes into hell. When the believer dies, though his body is also buried in the ground, his soul goes immediately into heaven. As Paul reveals to us in 2 Corinthians 5:8, we are of good courage, I say, and are willing rather to be absent from the body and to be at home with the Lord. To be in heaven at death is to be with Jesus. Philippians 1:23 makes the same point. But I am in a strait betwixt the two, having the desire to depart and be with Messiah, for it is very far better. When the first resurrection occurs, this is the first resurrection, remember, is believers only. When the first resurrection occurs, the bodies of the believers will be resurrected and reunited with their souls. This will occur at the rapture for the church saints. For the Old Testament and tribulation saints, it will occur after the second coming. At the time of the second resurrection, this is the second resurrection, the unsaved, the unbelievers, the bodies of the unsaved will be resurrected and the souls of hell will be removed to be reunited with the bodies. And at that time, The hell portion of Sheol will also be eliminated because hell will not be the eternal abode of the lost. The lake of fire will be the final abode. And this is when they come before the great white throne judgment to be judged on the basis of their works, the degrees of punishment. So hell is a place of torment for the soul only, but the lake of fire will be a place of torment for both soul and body. Heaven, on the other hand, will not be the eternal abode of the believer, as we will see in the next section. And if you want to, you can check out the last 2 chapters of the book of Revelation. They'll tell you where we'll all be. And that ends it for this session. And the next session will be the final in this series. Thank you for coming along. Study hard and grow strong.